Matt, are we ready to go? Yep. Okay, so let's start. Well, good morning to all, and hopefully you are able to hear us as well as see us on your screen. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Evaluation of Administrators in Connecticut State Department of Education's Approved Private Special Education Programs. This webinar was designed by the Connecticut Association of Schools in partnership with the Connecticut State Department of Education and CREC to provide evaluators of administrators with basic information related to the process of administrator evaluation and support. During the 2015-2016 academic year, Connecticut State Department of Education approved private special education programs will be participating in a required pilot of the 2015 SEED Handbook, inclusive of adaptations for the approved special education programs. Today's webinar, in addition to a one-day in-person training on December 3rd, will fulfill the training requirement for evaluators of administrators. Before we begin, let me inform each of you that you have the ability to ask questions during our webinar. We would ask that you use the question area in the control panel that you see before you. And we're going to pause periodically to respond to your questions, so we may not answer them immediately. But there are periods during this webinar where we will hold and respond to any questions regarding that particular section of work. The adapted version of the 2015 SEED Handbook for approved private special education programs is now available and may be obtained by contacting consultant Sharon Fuller at the Connecticut State Department of Education. In this webinar, we will explore the yearly evaluation and support cycle described in SEED, the 4 evaluation components which comprise the annual summative rating, and how each component and summative rating is determined. The guidelines for educator evaluation use multiple measures of leadership performance to improve student achievement and leadership practice within Connecticut schools. Any educator in a position requiring the O92 certification and working under an administrative contract will be evaluated under this system. And an important part of this system is providing professional learning opportunities and feedback for administrators to support their continued growth and improvement. Fostering self-reflection on one's leadership practices is also a key component of the growth process. As shown here, the 4-part rating system describes the expectations for each level of performance. And these performance levels will be used for both the component sections as well as the summative rating. The administrator evaluation system has 4 components which are rated individually and with varying weights. These components combine to determine the summative rating for the school year. Each of these components will be discussed in depth in the following sections of our webinar. It's important to note that we will focus more in depth on the new Connecticut Leader Evaluation and Support Rubric 2015 and the leadership practice component itself in the one-day in-person training, which will be held on December 3rd at the CREC headquarters located at 111 Charter Oak Avenue in Hartford. Specific dimensions of the evaluation system occur on an annual basis throughout the typical school year. Each step in this timeline will be discussed as we progress through this webinar. If your program provides services on a 12-month cycle, you may adjust the timing of the steps in the process as long as all steps are included each school year. Since the student learning goals and objectives that your teachers develop should be aligned to the student learning goals that administrators develop, administrator goal setting should begin prior to the start of school, or in September at the latest. Using the SEED model, administrators will develop 6 goals based upon your analysis of available data as indicated in the top box on this slide. Other local data may also be included. We will discuss each area of goal development during our webinar. But please note that while the guidelines require a minimum of 2 locally determined measures of student performance for administrators, the SEED model requires 3 student learning indicators. And hence we'll be using the SEED model, which corresponds with your required pilot. As you develop your goals, keep in mind alignment to your program's priorities. Particular attention should be paid to the sources of evidence and levels of performance which will determine the rating for each goal. Your goals should be attainable, but represent a realistic challenge for your own growth and for that of your students and teachers. The guidelines require that your evaluator meet with you in mid-year to review your progress toward attaining the goals which were set in the fall. This is an excellent time to discuss your professional practice and potential growth opportunities for the remainder of the school year. If unforeseen issues have arisen, which significantly may impede your ability to meet any of your goals, this is also a good time to discuss any possible revisions to those goals. Now let's pause for a moment and answer any questions that you may have regarding our presentation. All right, I guess we're doing well. It appears we have no questions so far. So let's continue on with stakeholder feedback. Stakeholder feedback is weighted as 10% of the administrator's summative rating. And while the guidelines require school-based administrators to solicit feedback from parents and teachers, one of the adaptations during the approved private special ed program required pilot is to include feedback from other stakeholders who may have a vested interest in your program. Here we've shown some examples such as LEAs and other referring agencies such as DCF and the juvenile justice system, as well as including foster and surrogate parents. Administrators will determine a stakeholder target based upon data and feedback which they have analyzed from parents and teachers, as well as other stakeholders determined by your program. Surveys are the most common method for obtaining stakeholder feedback. And stakeholder feedback targets should reflect growth and improvement over time, except in those cases where ratings are already high. In these cases, maintaining the high targets would be the administrator's goal. Step 1 is to review the results from parent and teacher surveys, as well as other stakeholders as appropriate, and to look for common areas where improved performance is desired. Here we show you 2 examples of baseline data. And going into step 2, the administrator has determined in this example that a realistic and challenging target would be to move from 60 to 70% of teachers responding strongly agree to the following statement: the program environment is caring and supportive. So that is going to be the target that this administrator sets for his stakeholder goal. During the goal-setting conference, which was held in the fall, a mutually agreed upon target or range of benchmarks were established. For our example, in example 1, meeting the target growth of 70% would yield a proficient rating. Perhaps a growth rating of 75% or higher might yield an exemplary rating, while 65 to 69% might yield a developing rating. Less than 65% could yield a rating of below standard. In each of your fall conferences, you should be establishing similar rating targets when you come to the stakeholder survey. Now let's pause for any questions that you may have regarding this aspect, this component of our webinar. Okay, we have no questions here either. So let's briefly discuss leadership practice. And leadership practice is weighted at 40% of the summative rating that is derived at the end of the school year. The leadership practice component allows administrators to identify their areas of strength and areas that may need improvement, as well as to determine supports and professional learning that will allow them to continue to develop and to improve their professional practices. Remember, this component and the rubric that accompanies this component will really be explored in depth in our December 3rd workshop. The Common Core of Leading, Connecticut School Leader Standards, are represented on this slide in the purple band, and they have not changed. These continue to be the standards for school leaders in Connecticut. The Connecticut Leader Evaluation and Support Rubric 2015 integrates these 6 performance expectations of the CCL into 4 domains within the new rubric. And these domains are seen in the gray band on the slide before you. Student learning continues to be at the core of evaluator education, of educator evaluation, I'm sorry. So again, student learning is the core of what we're doing here. The Connecticut Leader Evaluation and Support Rubric 2015 consists of 4 domains. Each domain has 2 or 3 indicators, and each indicator is displayed on a separate page in the rubric and is further broken down into attributes, which are listed on the left-hand column on each page of the rubric. In order to promote discussion between program leaders and their evaluators, it's important to understand a common vocabulary of the rubric. So to begin with, we have our 4 domains. In this case, we're highlighting Domain 1, Instructional Leadership, which is weighted the heaviest within this process. Under each domain are 2 to 3 indicators. And here we're showing you indicator 1.1, shared vision, mission, and goals. Within each indicator are attributes. The attributes are those, that language which tends to explain the indicator. It gives some further in-depth definition to what we mean in this case by shared vision, mission, and goals. We expect high expectations. We expect to see action plans, school improvement plans, and goals, etc. So you have 3 vocabulary terms that are associated with that rubric. Administrators will be rated on each of the 4 domains of the rubric. The evidence collected by the evaluator should reflect most, if not all, of the indicators for that domain. And again, the attributes help administrators and their evaluators key in on specific areas of strength or need of improvement by helping to define the indicator. Evaluators should base an administrator's overall leadership practice rating on a preponderance of evidence in all 4 domains in combination with professional judgment. The evaluation process now requires evaluators of administrators to conduct a minimum number of observations. These observations will provide evidence that is the basis for high-quality feedback, allows the administrator to reflect on his or her practice, informs professional learning needs, and informs leadership practice. The minimum number of observations for most administrators will be 2. However, on this slide you see that in special situations, additional observations are required. Administrators will reflect upon their practice using the Connecticut Leader Evaluation and Support Rubric 2015 and with input from their evaluators. They will set 2 growth targets called focus areas. While focus areas are not rated, these goals will often impact the rating of professional practice overall. One focus area must be related to elements of Domain 1, instructional leadership, while the second focus area may relate to any of the remaining 3 domains, or you may have 2 focus areas related to Domain 1. The total rating for the practice component is a combination of the stakeholder feedback rating and the performance practice rating. A rating is entered for each component, and based on the appropriate weight, a point value is determined for each category. These values are then combined into a single practice rating worth 50% of the annual summative evaluation, as illustrated by the chart on this slide. So in this case, our example shows the administrator receiving a score of 2 for the observation of leadership practice. Leadership practice is weighted at 40%, so 2 times 40 gives us 80 points. In a similar fashion, the administrator received a rating of proficient, or 3, for stakeholder feedback. That is rated at 10%, so we have 30 points there for a total of 110 points. And if you look down below at the chart, 81 to 126 points yields a practice rating of developing. So let's pause for any questions you may have regarding the professional practice component, which we've described briefly and will describe more in length at the December 3rd workshop. Wow, my colleagues here are telling me that there are no questions, so either we're doing an excellent job or we're hoping there's someone out there listening to the webinar. All right, we'll move on. This next section will discuss the Student Learning Indicator rating, and this rating accounts for 45% of the administrator's summative evaluation rating. Student learning indicators currently consist of 3 equally weighted, locally determined indicators of student learning. For the 2015-2016 required pilot, state test data will not be used as part of an administrator's evaluation. Thus, administrators in approved private special ed programs will develop 3 locally determined indicators of student learning. Student learning indicators should reflect coherence among the program's goals, the administrator's goals, and teacher goals. This coherence keeps everyone focused on a common direction for student learning. Student learning indicators for administrators are expressed in SMART goal terminology. And here we have an example of specific SMART goal aspects which are defined for you. Again, SMART comes from the fact that the goals are specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, which means there's rigor, yet they're realistic. They're relevant, they center on student needs, they challenge students, and they're time-bound. These goals will be measured within a specific period of time, whether it be a semester or a year, depending on your program format. The student learning indicator development process requires administrators to set learning priorities and to carefully consider appropriate measures of progress, instructional strategies, and resources which will be needed to reach the desired target. This student learning indicator exhibits the components of a SMART goal structure. The indicator is time-bound. It will end by June. It's measurable, looking at a 10% reduction. It addresses action to be accomplished on behalf of students. and is attainable but ambitious since it rests upon an expansion of a new program into the any town school system. So take a moment to look at this particular slide as it breaks down the components of an example student learning indicator for you. Locally determined student learning indicators should include at least one indicator that is based on grades or subjects that are not assessed on a state administrative test. If you are a program leader for a program that includes high school students, you will need to base one of your student learning indicators on the graduation rate or successful program completion rate of the students you serve. During the fall goal-setting conference, the administrator and evaluator set parameters around a desired target, which will govern the successful attainment of each student learning indicator. Based upon the criteria in the SEED model, the rating for the student learning indicators component is determined. So again, this is an example of where collegial and collaboration occurs and conversations are needed in the fall to establish how you're going to measure each specific target for each of the 3 student learning indicators. Once you have established for each student learning indicator whether the target was reached, exceeded, or perhaps progress was made toward the target, but not the target wasn't reached in total, then you begin looking at the chart exhibited on this particular slide to see where the administrator would fall for the total rating for student learning indicators. Let's pause at this point for any questions you may have regarding the student learning indicator component. All right. So far we're batting 100, so we'll move on to our final component. And the final component to be discussed is the teacher effectiveness outcomes. These outcomes are rated at 5% of the administrator's summative rating. Teachers, as well as students and educator support specialists, will receive a rating on the student learning goals or objectives component of their own evaluations. The rating that the administrator receives for the teacher effectiveness outcomes component is based on the percentage of teachers as well as student and educator support specialists who attain or exceed their student learning goal or objective targets. The chart shown here is the criteria for rating administrators on the teacher effectiveness outcomes component within the SEED model. So to receive a rating of proficient, as you can see on the chart in the bottom of this slide, 61 to 80% of the teachers who are evaluated by this particular administrator must have received a rating of proficient or higher on the student growth portion of their evaluation. So this is an attempt to ensure that administrators are working with teachers for success on the teacher evaluation process as well. Using the ratings for student learning indicators and teacher effectiveness outcomes, we'll employ the same mathematical process as we did earlier for professional practice to determine the total number of points for the outcomes rating. This total is then plotted again against the chart to determine a single number rating for the student outcomes component. And once again, if you take a look at this particular slide, this administrator received a rating of proficient for their student learning goals indicators. The weight is 45%, therefore it's 3 times 45. That's how we derived the 135 points. Teacher effectiveness, less than 61% of the teachers received a rating of proficient or exemplary, but it was within the developing range, so the administrator receives a 2. It's 5% of the summative rating, so again, 2 times 5 gives us the 10 points that are in the column far to the right. We have a total of 145 points. We go to the chart in the bottom of this slide, 127 to 174 points. The range is proficient. Therefore, for the outcome rating, this administrator is rated as proficient. He or she receives a 3. Prior to the summative conference, the administrator should review progress on all 6 targets and utilize the Connecticut Leader Evaluation and Support Rubric 2015 to reflect upon areas of success and strengths, areas which may still need improvement, and overall leadership practice and performance. This self-evaluation occurs prior to the summative conference with the observer. As indicated on this slide, the summative conference is an opportunity to review progress on the 6 goals and to look forward to growth areas for the coming school year. Remember, each of the 4 components of an administrator's evaluation will receive a rating that is combined into an outcomes rating and a practice rating, and then are merged into a final summative rating. This graphic is another way to review the 4 components and their relationships within the summative rating process. So again, student learning and teacher effectiveness combined into outcomes, leadership practice and stakeholder feedback combined into practice rating. Each of them merge 50% into a final rating. And that final rating is determined by this matrix. This matrix is used to combine the outcomes rating and the practice rating to determine the final summative rating, which an administrator will receive. So, for example, an outcomes rating of 4, and outcomes are rated on the left-hand side of this matrix, and a practice rating of 3, and you'll notice the practice rating goes across the top of this matrix, result in a summative rating of 4 or exemplary. So essentially you're plotting horizontally and vertically across the matrix, and the box on which you land is the summative rating that is given to the administrator. So in this case, a 4 on the outcomes across, a 3 on practice down, ends up with a summative rating of exemplary. And again, to review what those 4 ratings would be, this particular slide gives you that definition. So exemplary is substantially exceeding. This administrator actually could serve as a role model for other leaders. Proficient is where we expect most educators to be, including school leaders. This is an expectation of experienced administrators in particular. Not only are you meeting all the indicators of performance, but you are an effective school leader. Developing indicates that there are some areas which still need to receive some work. New administrators will often fall in the developing category simply because they are brand new and need additional practice and work and guidance by their observer. Multiple years at this level, however, becomes a concern. So while developing, particularly for new administrators, is acceptable for 1 or 2 years, we should see these folks begin to move into the proficient range. Below standard is a serious situation where indicators of performance are seriously lacking. So let's stop and see if there are any questions at this point. Okay, you're being exceedingly kind. Well, wait, I think there's one coming in. I feel like a radio talk host here.
This is Sharon. The question that we just received was regarding the 2015 SEED handbook that has been adapted for Connecticut State Department of Education approved private special education programs. If you do not have a copy of that handbook, please feel free to email me and I will be glad to send it to you. My email address is Sharon, SHARON, .Fuller, FULLER, @ct.gov. Basically, that handbook is the 2015 SEED handbook, the state model, with some proposed adaptations to accommodate the unique circumstances in the approved private special education programs.
Thank you, Sharon. And again, if you didn't write fast enough with Sharon's email address, it will appear on the final slide of the webinar. So again, we'll give you another opportunity to get that information. And we have an additional question coming in.
So we've had another question asking to review the timeline for implementation. That's a great question. So this year, the 2015-2016 year, is designated as a required pilot for all of your programs, the approved private special education programs. What that means is that throughout the year, the evaluation of teachers and the evaluation of administrators needs to take place based on the SEED handbook that has been adapted for the private special education programs. We are here, and collectively, that's the State Department of Education. We have CAS as is representative of CAS, and Carol Kirkin is here with us from CREC. We are here to support you in that process. So at the conclusion of this webinar, if you still have continued questions, again, you can feel free to send them to me via email, and we will respond to everyone with some frequently asked questions and answers. So at the conclusion of the 2016 school year, you and your programs will have a little more flexibility in terms of the plan that you will use moving forward for the evaluation and support of both teachers and administrators. And we'll talk a little more about that on the December 3rd workshop.
Great. Thank you, Sharon, again. I'll hold just for another second to see if we have any additional questions. Looking at my colleagues, we seem to have answered two, so let's move forward. And remind you that the Connecticut State Department of Education approved private special education programs will participate in the required pilot of the 2015 SEED model, which has been adapted for approved private special ed programs. As part of the required pilot, the Connecticut State Department of Education, in partnership with the Community Training and Assistance Center, known as CAS-CIAC, will conduct an implementation study of educator evaluation and support in the approved private special ed programs. As such, CAS-CIAC will be seeking input from educators in those programs during 2015-2016 in order to identify promising practices, provide recommendations, and analyze results to help determine any changes that may be needed in the guidelines for educator evaluation. CAS-CIAC will be reaching out to you via surveys and focus groups, and we appreciate in advance your candid insights and feedback regarding this process. Again, a final reminder, as we mentioned earlier, we will be holding a one-day in-person workshop on December 3rd. That workshop will concentrate on the new leader rubric, professional practice, and coaching strategies. However, we will also be available to answer additional questions you may have about any aspect of this process. So should you leave this webinar and suddenly come up with a question or two and you plan on being at the December 3rd workshop, even though it doesn't relate to professional practice, we certainly would welcome your questions at that time. As Sharon indicated, we're here to support you in this process. So, if you have additional questions that you would like to email to Sharon, please feel free to do so. Now, this is her contact information located on the bottom of this slide. If I can help at the Connecticut Association of Schools, my information is located here as well. But we'd like to thank you for being with us in this webinar. Hopefully we've answered some of your questions, and we have an additional one coming in here at the end. So let's pause for a moment, and we'll take this question as well.
Yes, so thank you. We've had a question asking if this PowerPoint will be available. This entire webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to you. CAS will send out a link to the recorded webinar once we transfer that into the appropriate format. So you can look in your emails in the next day or two, and we hope to have that available for you.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. And I think that concludes our work for today, except we have another question. You all held them to the end. All right. Well, let's make sure we get them answered.
So the question is, how are we registered as attended?
If you registered through CAS for this particular webinar, that registration was a dual registration. And matter of fact, we're looking at your names right now. So we have you both for the webinar as well as for the December 3rd workshop at CREC. So you need to do nothing further as long as you registered for this webinar through CAS. And if you didn't, please email me and I'll make sure that you get on the registration format. Okay. Last call for any final questions since we're on the last slide of the webinar. I don't want to shut anyone off because this is important work, so I want to make sure that you're okay with it. And Sharon?
So thank you all for participating in this webinar. We really worked hard to try to accommodate your needs in taking a traditionally 2-day in-person training and combining it into this webinar and then the one-person or the in-day session on December 3rd. So we definitely welcome your feedback on this mode of delivering this training. The other thing that I wanted to share with you, and it's back to the question about the required pilot and the timeline. Part of the reason we are doing a pilot this year is to learn whether some of these adaptations make sense in your programs. We realized that some of the guidelines don't apply as nicely and neatly to the context of your programs, so we wanted to come up with some components that would make sense for you, your administrators, and your teachers. So as we go through the year, we will be looking for your feedback so we can determine how successful this pilot was and whether we need to make some changes or adaptations moving forward. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks to each of you, and this concludes our webinar for this morning. Again, we'll be sending a link out to each of you who are on our registration folder so that you can go back and review this webinar. And we certainly would welcome each and every one of you to the December 3rd workshop at CREC at 111 Charter Oak in Hartford. And we look forward to meeting with you in person at that time. So on behalf of all of us here, have a happy Thanksgiving, and this concludes our webinar.